All right, folks, hello and welcome back to online English class. I hope you guys are doing well today. Today we're going to be finishing up OTN 1, which is an extended analysis of Chapter 1 of 1984. Just a quick reminder of the work that we have done this week and also that you need to be continuing to work on throughout the course of this week. Vocabulary and grammar quizzes continue to be suspended. You need to continue your reading of Part 1 of 1984. Again, it's a lengthy reading assignment, so make sure you're breaking it up. I should already have confirmation of your OTN 6 from the Solitary Reaper in Unit 5. All right, that should have come to me by 3 p.m. On Wednesday, yesterday. And then aside from that, you just need to make sure that you're continuing to complete your OTNs as we work through them in class. Today we're going to be finishing up OTN 1. All right, in terms of ongoing assignments, you need to make sure that your Quarter 4 essay, that you're aware of it, that you've downloaded the prompt, read it, digested it, and perhaps begun the process of thinking about what your thesis is going to be, how you're going to answer that prompt, okay? We'll be looking at that prompt in more detail in later video lectures, okay? So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump back into OTN 1 and complete our close reading of Chapter 1 by analyzing the characterization of Winston Smith and then making some quick observations about the narrative voice or the perspective from which the narrative is delivered. Okay, so the primary question that we're going to spend most of this class thinking about is what kind of man Winston Smith is, what kind of person our protagonist is, how he is characterized in Chapter 1. All right, to quickly review, in the conclusion of our last lecture, which analyzed the setting developed in 1984 Chapter 1, we asserted that all in all, Orwell develops a dystopian setting that has arrested or taken control of every aspect of Winston's life, from his outward behavior to his innermost heart and his innermost mind, controlling what he and other citizens in Oceania are able to think is true and real, and what they are able to love and hate. Okay, so they not only exert control over the outward behavior or physical well-being of their citizens, but also control the internal lives of their citizens, solidifying their power by exerting totalitarian authority over the internal components of their human citizens. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the answer to the question, what kind of person is Winston Smith? How is he characterized in the narrative, and what are the significances of his characterization? Okay, so we're continuing OTN 1. All right, that is our close reading of Chapter 1 of the narrative. All right, we're looking closely at the characterization of Winston Smith. Okay, so very similar to last lecture, I'm going to start with an assertion. Okay, the first assertion, the first interpretive assertion, all right, that I'm going to defend with textual evidence is that Winston Smith, who is the protagonist or the primary striver or primary figure of the narrative, is characterized simply as an everyman figure facing a midlife existential crisis that causes him to reevaluate the meaning of his life. All right, so this is perhaps the simplest observation, but Winston Smith, who is middle-aged, is meant to be read as a kind of common man. He's not an epic hero. All right, and he is being faced with something that we call, just sort of colloquially, existential crisis. He is at a crisis in which he is investigating the meaning of his existence, reevaluating the meaning of his existence. Now, a couple areas of the text that illustrate this to us. On page 1 in the first paragraph, Orwell just introduces us very simply to the name of our protagonist, Winston Smith. And Smith, all right, is just a very bland name. It's one of the most common names in the English-speaking societies, which just helps develop this impression that this individual, all right, is meant to be read as an everyman figure, as a common person, as someone who is not necessarily special or uniquely suited for this dramatic overthrow of the totalitarian society that he lives in. He's not necessarily a hero or a heroic figure. Okay, he's also 39. Okay, he is a middle-aged individual. This signals that he's already arrived at adulthood. Okay, so There's a kind of story that's very popular in Western fiction called a coming-of-age tale, and that's about a young person, an adolescent person, someone your own age's, journey into adulthood as they sort of solidify an understanding of their value system, or they fail to do so. A great example of a coming-of-age narrative, which this story is not, is like the Creature's character arc in Frankenstein. Okay, so that's the story of a young person coming to grips with what it means to be an adult, and he fails to do so effectively. He fails to do so in a moral way, and obviously he pays a price for that. But the reason why he fails is obviously complex, and that would require us to get back into Frankenstein. But it's not that kind of story. It's the story of an existential crisis in which an adult, a person who has already come of age, is confronted with the upsetting reality that their existence up to this point has been meaningless and empty. All right? Heart of Darkness, a story about the middle-aged protagonist Marlowe, is a great example of this, as well as the story Dante's Inferno, or the Divine Commedia as a whole, right? Those are both stories about middle-aged individuals who go on a kind of spiritual journey in which they are confronted with the fact that their old views of their lives were wrong, okay, and they have to reevaluate everything, okay. On page 2, this impression is even further solidified for us as we evidence this assertion that Winston Smith is characterized as a kind of every man facing a midlife crisis. He's described as small, frail, and meager of body, okay. So in literary speak, obviously, okay, literally, he's just small, all right? He's not like, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, right? In the movie version, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson wouldn't play Winston Smith, okay? But in literary speak, okay, Orwell's sort of signaling to us that this character is not meant to be read in the same sort of arc as like epic heroes, people like Aeneas or Achilles or Odysseus, these other great heroes, protagonists of Western literature that fight and embody the values of their civilization, fight for and embody the values of their civilization. Here, Winston Smith, alternatively, is just a small, meager, a frail man, okay? And finally, okay, in Chapter 1, the rash act to commit thought crime, which is the essential sin in his society, the essential sin that will cost him his life, suggests that Winston Smith is at a point in his life, at such an intense existential crisis, that he is willing to die in order to find meaning. He's willing to risk every part of his existence to redeem something that has been lost, okay? And that thing that has been lost is his liberty, okay, his freedom, okay? Second interpretive assertion, okay? Winston, this is going to get more complicated. Winston, like all citizens of Oceania, is not only completely under the party's control in a physical sense, okay, but he is completely under their physical control. His behavior is constantly monitored. His life, his liberty, the ways that he pursues happiness, all of them are under the control, the physical control of the party, but he's also psychologically or internally controlled by the party, okay? This is expressed to us in his complex and contradictory desires and actions, okay? So if you read chapter 1 of part 1 carefully, you're going to see all of these contradictory, seemingly antithetical desires and behaviors and thoughts that come across the mind of Winston Smith. So Winston's internal life, his mind, his heart, his soul, mirrors his external environment. Both are characterized by unreconcilable opposites. Okay? In other words, Winston's life, very much like the government that dominates it, doesn't make sense. Okay? It is illogical. It does not reflect reality. So in the same way that the party's slogans, the essential articulations of their value system, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, okay? Much in that same way, right, Winston's internal life is contradictory and seemingly out of his control. Okay, so this is evidenced on page 8 and 9. Let's quickly flip to page 8 and 9. All right, when he attempts to write down his thoughts, all right, this is his sort of first attempt to catalog his rebellious thoughts against Big Brother. And his first attempt makes almost no sense. He just starts scribbling down what he calls later, or the narrator calls later, streams of rubbish. He's talking about a war film that he saw the other day in which innocent enemies of the party are gunned down by helicopters, and everyone in the theater sort of claps their hands and laughs as these poor Jewesses and child Jews are killed. All right, he describes this movie as, quote, very good. And then he talks about a, quote, wonderful shot. All right, these images, these violent images, even as Winston is trying to free his mind from the control of the party, his thoughts are scattered. They're grammatically incoherent. They almost read like one of your some of your essays at times, right? There's very few periods. There's not capital letters. The language just doesn't very much make any sense. And the things that he's actually saying contradict the humane thoughts that he's trying to develop. Okay, he's glorifying what the party would want him to glorify here. So again, even as he attempts to rebel, his rebellion is kind of undercut or self-contradicting. All right, this is later made evident or sort of impressed even further as he expresses his emotional experiences during the 2 minutes hate. Okay, so in that elongated period in which the narrator is describing Winston's actions during the 2 minutes hate, all right, which we discussed yesterday, Winston Smith on page 14 finds himself in what he calls a lucid moment, which is just to say he sort of becomes aware of himself. All right, he becomes aware of what he is doing for a second, and he's shouting and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. He's joined in with the 2 minutes hate. All right, which doesn't make sense because once again, what he does not like being controlled in this way. He wants to be free, but here he is joining in, and then right as the 2 minutes hate progresses, at one moment he turns his hatred towards Goldstein, and the next against Big Brother, and then the next against the girl from the fiction department, right? That he has already told us that he is attracted to, but also fantasizes about like sexually assaulting and killing. All right? So, in other words, Winston's internal life, his emotional responses, his loves and his hatreds are irrational. They make no sense. They are erratic. He simultaneously desires and also wants to kill a young girl. That it would be natural, not a young girl, okay, but a girl that is of age, an adult woman he's attracted to, and he wants to kill her. Okay, he finds himself hating Goldstein, who he wants to join. He finds himself adoring Big Brother, who he hates. In other words, Winston's psychology or internality is equally nonsensical as the environment in which he lives, which is an expression of their totalitarian control over Winston's loves and hates and his mind, right? Next assertion. Winston, by the end of the chapter, puts himself in conflict with the totalitarian, nonsensical environment by committing thought crime and recording it in his journal. So this is an attempt, all right, this is Winston's attempt to fight against, to arrest control back of his mind, his heart, his self, from the nonsensical totalitarian government that is manifested in his emotional responses and internal responses and also external actions all throughout chapter 1. Okay? So when he does this, when he commits thought crime and writes it down in a journal, Winston is attempting to free his mind and his heart from unconscious, which is to say, not conscious obedience and not conscious disobedience, but rather just unconscious, irrational love of Big Brother. Okay? So he's trying to free his mind and his heart from that, from unconscious submission to the party, and to begin thinking, loving, and hating for himself in ways that are logical, or in another way of saying that would be in ways that mirror his value system instead of the value system imposed on him by the party. Okay, so this is first evident, it's interesting, in just a little tiny detail, right, in his purchase of what he calls, back on page 6, right, ready, what does he buy? This is the beginning of his rebellion, right? He buys a beautiful book, all right? He buys a book that he deems beautiful, and he is not supposed to have it. What part of the party's control of his life is he rebelling against when he purchases this, quote, beautiful book? Well, he is rebelling. Or what is beauty? Well, it's something that is highly valuable. It's something that, it's a possession, it's a thing. I think back to our meditations on the nature of beauty from the Solitary Reaper. It's something, okay, that is highly valuable. Okay, something that is worthy of adoration and meditation on. And when he buys this book, okay, what he is doing is he is exercising his own value system. The party forbids the ownership of possessions like this. Why? Because the party controls its citizens' notions of, ready, plenty, right? Its citizens' notions of what they want, of what they need. Okay? Here, Winston, risking his life, buys a beautiful book, a possession that he personally deems valuable in his own mind. And this is a rebellion against the party's control of his notion of plenty. Okay? So once again, as asserted above, he's attempting to free his mind and his heart, his value system, from unconscious submission to the party, to begin thinking, loving, and hating for himself. Okay? Now this is also evident in another very simple act. The first thing that he writes is the date on page 7. And Orwell really emphasizes this in the narration by using these sort of paragraph breaks that set off in italics this date. Okay? The first thing that Winston writes is the date. Well, why does that matter? Well, here, this simple act of writing down the date is an act of, in that very moment, of Winston becoming a kind of historian. All right, now this is not like a history textbook that he is writing, and he's not becoming like a history teacher, but he is writing down a record of reality. He's writing down a record of his own independent thoughts, of his own individual experiences. Okay? And what does that rebel against? That is a rebellion against the party's control of records. Okay, which, if you remember from yesterday, is the business of the ministry of truth. Okay, what has happened in the past? What truly, actually happened? Right? This defies the party's control of truth. Okay, he has become a truth teller. He has become a historian. He has become a documenter, a record keeper. of reality. Next, this is evident in his journal entry. Okay, now the extended journal entry after the nonsense garbage, right? The next thing that he starts writing about is his experiences in the 2 Minutes Hate. All right. Now, as I already talked about, his emotional experiences, the things that he says about, or the things that the narrator reveals about Winston's internal life during the 2 Minutes Hate are deeply contradictory. But the fact that he begins to analyze them, the fact that he begins to write them down and think carefully about them and try and make sense out of them and try and reorient his mind and his heart away from and understand the workings of his own mind and heart and reorient them into ways that actually make sense is also, in and of itself, just the fact that he is thinking through these contradictory experiences, okay, is evidence of Winston's attempt to free his mind and his heart from unconscious submission to the party as he consciously evaluates, and carefully considers, critically analyzes the meaning of his chaotic emotional experiences, attempting to disentangle his contrary desires and reactions. He wants to make sense out of his heart, which defies the party's totalitarian control of what? His loves and his hates. Okay? Now, this is also evident later in the chapter in his decisive statement, repeated for emphasis over and over again at the end of the chapter, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother. All caps, set off. Again, Orwell uses the typeface here to add emphasis to these decisive thoughts. Okay? So not only is this an act of physical, okay, or a kind of physical threat to Big Brother's power, because obviously Winston wants to see him fall from power, wants to see him fall from influence, but it also, on a deeper or internal level, it's an expression, right? It's an expression of a clear thought. In contrast to his unclear thoughts during the 2 Minutes Hate, in contrast to his earlier emotional and intellectual chaos, right? The chapter ends with Winston asserting a kind of clarity, a clear thought that expresses hatred for the evil that Big Brother embodies. So that comment in and of itself, right, sort of encapsulates Winston's rebellion as he frees his mind, his conscious mind, from the nonsensical, tyrannical, unconscious submission to the party, all right, and also his heart, as he reiterates over and over again, venting his hatred for the evil that Big Brother embodies, all right? So before you quickly oversimplify hate and say, well, this is bad, all hate is bad, so Winston is doing something bad, right? Hating what is evil is good, right? In the Christian tradition, hating one's sin, okay, is part of what is in direct relationship to the extent to which an individual loves righteousness, okay? So much in the same way, when Winston Smith expresses this hatred for Big Brother, what he is also expressive, what he is also sort of what he is also expressing at the same time is the extent of his love for something other than Big Brother, which is thought crime, which is a great sin in Oceana's society. Okay. So finally, all right, last thing I want to mention is his fascination and focus on the two other characters that play an important role in the chapter, okay? The girl from the fiction department, which he's going to have a romantic relationship with later, and O'Brien, who he's also going to have a friendship with later, illustrates his desire for relationship with fellow rebels or friends. Just very simply, Winston wants friends. Winston is lonely. Okay? He wants friends that he can love, that he can sacrifice for, that exist outside of Big Brother. Okay? So remember yesterday when we were talking about the ways in which Big Brother attempts to, and the party attempts to satisfy its citizens' needs for intimate relationship by casting themselves as their comrades, as their brother, right? Here, Winston is attempting to free himself from that false form of relational intimacy and to find it authentically with an individual of the opposite sex, okay, who's going to have a romantic relationship with, and a peer, a friend, okay? So, in all these ways, Winston Smith, our everyman character, who the totalitarian dystopian setting has exerted its control on, right, turning him into this sort of amalgam of contrary, nonsensical, emotional, and physical expressions, is attempting to arrest control back of his own identity, of his own existence, of his own internal mind, heart, soul. This is the beginning of Winston's rebellion. All right, the rest of the novel will explore the consequences, the meaning of Winston's rebellion. All right, so last but not least, let's draw a conclusion about the narrative voice. The narrative voice is third person omniscient, okay? And that basically means one of two things, all right? Either this story is written and constructed by an individual who is looking back on Winston's experiences as a rebel and guessing what he was thinking and feeling this whole time, or it was written by an individual who knew for a fact what Winston Smith was experiencing throughout the course of his experiences as a rebel. That is going to, just keep that in mind. All right, I'm just going to leave it there for now. Keep that in mind throughout the course of the novel, and we'll circle back to the significance of the narrative voice later in our analysis. All right, I hope you guys have a great extended weekend, and we will reconvene on Tuesday. Remember your email reading check.